Chapter 28. I slipped through the steel door and into the blackness on the other side. I ignored the darkness until it went away, and then began to move stealthily forward. I stopped with the Scooby-Doo action a couple of feet later and just started walking. Honestly, sneaking. It wasn't as though I could step on a twig or accidentally kick an old can and make a sound, right? Being a ghost, the problem wasn't being sneaky. It was getting noticed in the first place. Besides, nobody who was concerned about detecting my presence would be using their ears to sense me coming. I began extending my wizard senses out in front of me. When I say wizard senses, I mean it in a similar fashion to spider sense. Spidey's enhanced senses detect when he's in danger and warn him that he's got incoming. A wizard's senses don't do that, though I suppose with enough work someone could come close. What they do sense is the presence of magic, in both its natural state and its worked forms. You don't have to be concentrating to make it happen. It's natural in every practitioner. The theory I've heard espoused most often is that the ability to sense such energies makes it possible for a regular person to become a wizard, providing the kind of sensory feedback he needs to gradually work with more and more energy. So while a regular person who lacked the sense could technically learn how to use magic without it, it would be a process as difficult as someone who was born blind teaching himself to paint. I focused on that sense in me, partially blocking out my less important physical senses to give greater attention to the presence of magic in my surroundings. It was pretty thick in here. The door led to a concrete stairway going down into the earth, and each step bore lit candles and thickly painted magical symbols. The latent energy in the paint was almost devoid of arcane power, barely detectable, but it was there, and I saw it as faint phosphorescence. The energy of the beacon spell was still going strong. Somewhere in my head, I had evidently decided to interpret it as a sound because I could hear its slow throb like a bass beat on a big woofer. I went down the stairs, my senses attuned to the ground at my feet. What looked like one more bit of barely magical scribbling could be concealing something far more potent and dangerous. But it didn't. I went down 2 flights of stairs unmolested. The bottom of the stairway opened onto a rectangular room that had once been some sort of electrical junction. It obviously wasn't in service anymore. Large steel boxes and glass-faced readouts were spotted with rust and dust. There was more of the occult writing down here, all of it disjointed and fantastically disconnected, as if someone had composed a poem in a foreign language by randomly stringing together words from a dictionary. It all bore the same trace amounts of magical energy as the writing on the stairs. The big hoods evidently had a certain amount of latent talent, which seemed to fit together with the idea of the gray ghost recruiting some mortal flunkies to assist it in whatever the hell he or she was trying to do. What was he or she trying to do? I knew the gray ghost had attacked Mort's place, but why? Why take Mort to begin with? Granted, the little ectomancer could probably be a pain in the ass to any ghost who got too ambitious in Chicago, but the gray ghost's ambition seemed to have been limited to gunning for Morty. What could he possibly have to offer as a target? At the far end of the junction room, there was a gaping, ragged hole in the wall that looked like it had been made with sledgehammers. It opened onto a rough tunnel beyond, the beginnings of Undertown proper. A man's anguished scream came from the opening. I nearly burst into a sprint, but stopped myself. Unthinking sprints were a good way to get re-killed. Instead, I moved forward into the rough-hewn corridor. It was cold and damp, and slime and mold were everywhere. I unimagined the strong, musty smell that would otherwise have filled my nose, and paced forward, watching for traps and working hard not to move my feet in time with the bass drum rhythm of the beacon's spell. I passed a number of alcoves that joined the corridor. They were individual quarters for the big hoods, apparently. Each contained a mattress or an air mattress and something resembling bedding, only covered with mildew and mold. Each had a box or a couple of bags containing what I presumed to be personal belongings. More arcane gibberish covered the walls, along with slogans such as, "The lizard folk are already here, watch for their eyes." A couple of them looked occupied, with large, bulky forms snoring under the disgusting blankets. A minute or two later, the passage opened up into a torchlit room about the size of a hockey rink. The entrance was high up on one wall, so that my head was level with the larger room's ceiling. There were stairs cut into the wall beneath my feet so that I could walk down them into the large room, which I didn't, as it was packed full of bad guys. I swallowed and made sure my veil was still running strong. The bass beat of the beacon hammered loudly here, coming from a pit that had been cut into the floor. It must have been at least 10 feet across, and I couldn't tell how deep it was. It was surrounded by written formulae that were far less nonsensical than the others, and they sent out flashes of red dim light in time with each pulse of the beacon. The pit was full of wraiths. They swirled round and round in steady, mindless motion, each of them overlapping with dozens of others, so that it looked less like a group of beings moving in a circle than some bizarre stew with the occasional recognizable portion of human anatomy appearing above the mix. The hollow-knot scream of the empty-eyed wraiths was a huge and hideous sound, one that surged in time with the beacon. Maybe 24 lemurs were scattered around the room. They'd lowered their hoods, and without their faceless menace to back them up, they just looked like people. Some were standing, some were sitting. Another group was playing cards. Still others just stared at nothing, bemused. A group of big hoods was gathered around the pit, all but 2 of them on their knees and chanting. They bowed at regular intervals and clapped their hands together at others. A gallows that looked like it had been constructed out of a driveway basketball goal hung over the pit, with a pair of big hoods holding one end of the rope. Morty dangled from the other end, trussed up from his hips to his neck. He was swinging back and forth on the end of the line and slowly spinning. Gasps and broken sobbing sounds came from him. Standing in empty air directly before him, moving as he did, was the gray ghost. The figure looked at least as menacing as it had the first time around. When it spoke, its voice was liquid, calm, and feminine. "You need not do this to yourself, Mortimer," the gray ghost said. "I take no pleasure in inflicting pain. Yield. You will do it in the end. Save yourself the agony." Mort opened his eyes. He licked his lips and said in a cracked, thick voice, Go fuck yourself." The gray ghost murmured, then nodded and said, "Again?" No," Morty choked out, beginning to twist against his bonds. He accomplished nothing other than to start spinning more rapidly. "No!" The 2 big hoods holding the rope calmly lowered Mort down into the swirling pit of insanely hungry wraiths. They collapsed in on Morty, as if the surf could choose where it wished to crash, and it all wished to crash on the little ectomancer. The cauldron of mad ghosts boiled and congealed onto him, all but hiding him from sight. Mort began to scream again, a horrible, humiliated sound. 1, counted the gray ghost. 2, 3, 4. At the last number, the flunkies hauled him up out of the pool of wraiths, and Morty hung there, swinging back and forth and sobbing again, gasping for breath. "Each time you refuse me, Mortimer, I will add another second to the count," said the gray ghost. "I know what you're thinking. How many seconds will it take to drive you mad?" Mort tried to regain control of his breathing, but it was a futile effort. Tears marked his face. His nose had begun to run. He opened his eyes, his jaw clenched, his bald pate scarlet, and said, his voice cracking, "Go watch the sunrise." "Again," said the gray ghost. The big hoods lowered Morty into the pit once more. I didn't know what happened to a living mortal attacked by a wraith, but if Morty's reaction was any indicator, it wasn't good. Again, he screamed. It was higher pitched than a moment before, more raw. The screams all but drowned out the calm, monotonous count of the gray ghost. She went to 5, and then the big hoods hauled him up again. He twitched in spasmodic motion, as if he'd developed a simultaneous Charlie horse in every muscle and sinew. It took his screams at least 10 seconds to die away. "It's more art than science," the gray ghost continued, as if nothing had happened. "In my experience, most minds break before 7. Granted, most do not have your particular gifts. Whatever happens, I'm sure I will find it fascinating. I ask again, will you help me?" "Go jump in a river, bitch," Morty gasped. There was a moment of silence. "Again," the gray ghost snarled. "Slowly." The obedient big hoods began to lower Mort slowly toward the wraith pit again. Mort shook his head vainly and twisted his obviously battered body, trying to curl up and away from the swirling tide of hungry ghosts. He managed to forestall his fate by a few seconds, but in the end, he went down among the devouring spirits once more. He screamed again, and only after the scream had well and truly begun did the gray ghost start counting. I'd never really had the highest opinion of Morty. I had hated the way he'd neglected his talents and abused his clients for so long, back when I'd first met him. He'd gone up in my estimation since then, and especially in the past day. So maybe he wasn't a paragon of virtue, but he was still a decent guy in his own way. He was professional, and it looked like he'd had more juice all along than I thought he had. That said a lot about Morty, that he'd kept quiet about the extent of his ability. It said even more about him that he was standing in the lion's den with no way out and was still spitting his defiance into the face of his captor. Damn it, I thought. I liked the guy. And the gray ghost was destroying him, right in front of my eyes. Even as I watched, Morty screamed again as the wraiths surged against him, raking at him with their pale, gaunt fingers. The gray ghost's calm voice counted numbers. It felt like a minor infinity stretched between each. I couldn't get Mort out of this place. No way. Even if I went all out on the room and defeated every single hostile spirit in it, Mort would still be tied up and the big hoods would still be looming. There was no percentage in an attack. Yet standing around with my thumb up my ghostly ass wasn't an option either. I didn't know what the gray ghost was doing to Morty, but it was clearly hurting him. And judging from her dialogue, straight out of cheesy villain general casting though it might be, exposure to the wraiths would inflict permanent harm if Morty continued to refuse her. And there were the murderous spirits back at the ruins of Mort's house to think about too. And as if all that wasn't enough, sunrise was on the way. Damn it, I needed an edge, an advantage. The fingers of my right hand touched the solid wooden handle of Sir Stuart's pistol, and I was suddenly keenly aware of its power, of the sheer, tightly leashed potency of the weapon. Its energy hummed silently against my right palm. I remembered the fight at Morty's place, and the havoc Sir Stuart's weapon had wreaked among the enemy. Or rather, upon a single enemy. The gray ghost had feared Sir Stuart's gun, and I couldn't imagine she'd done so for no reason. If I could take her out, the other spirits who followed her would almost certainly scatter. The kind of jackals who followed megalomaniacs around rarely had the stomach for a confrontation without their leader to stiffen their spines, right? Sure, just because the Lemurs still outnumber you more than 12 to 1 doesn't mean they'll see you as an easy victim, Dresden. You'll be fine. There should be a rule against your own inner monologue throwing around that much sarcasm. But there was still merit in the idea. Kill the gray ghost and then run like hell. Even if the Lemurs came after me, at least the main voice who appeared to be guiding the big hoods would be silenced. It might even get all the malevolent spiritual attention entirely off of Morty. All I had to do was make one shot with Sir Stuart's pistol. No problem. If I missed, I probably wouldn't survive the experience, sure, but other than that, it should be a piece of cake. I gritted my teeth and began to move slowly toward the gray ghost. I didn't know how close I could get before my half-assed veil became useless, but I had to do everything I could to maximize the chances of a hit. I wasn't a marksman, and the pistols of the 18th century weren't exactly precision instruments, but I couldn't afford to miss. Of course, if the gray ghost sensed me coming, she would have time to run, to dodge, or to pull some sort of defense together. I had to kill her before she knew she was under attack. There was some irony there, considering the way I'd died. The gray ghost finished her count, and the big hoods hauled a sobbing Morty out of the pit again. He hung there, twitching, suffering, making involuntary sounds as he gasped for breath. The gray ghost stood in front of him, motionless, and I felt certain, gloating. 10 feet. I knew my veil was shoddy, and my aim only middling, but if I could close to 10 feet, I figured I had a fairly good chance of hitting the target. That would put me on the near edge of the wraith pit, shooting across it to hit the gray ghost. Of course, if I missed, the gray ghost wouldn't need to kill me. All she'd have to do was freaking trip me. The wraiths, once they sensed my presence, would be all over me. Then I'd get what Morty was getting, except that as a ghost myself, they'd be tearing me into tiny ectoplasm-soaked shreds and eating them. What fun, I thought. I tried to move steadily to keep myself calm. I didn't have any adrenaline anymore to make my hands shake, but they shook anyway. Damn it. I guess even a ghost is still on some level fundamentally human. Nothing for it but to keep moving. 30 feet. I passed within a few yards of a Lemur who was apparently staring into nothingness, though his eyes were lined up directly with me. Perhaps he was lost in a ghostly memory. He never blinked as I went by. 25. The wraiths wheezed out their starving, strangled howls in the pit a few feet ahead of me. 20. Why do I keep winding up in these situations, even after I'm dead? For the fun, I thought to myself. For the fun. Chapter 29. Then the floor near the gray ghost's feet rippled, and a human skull floated up out of it, its eye sockets burning with a cold blue flame. The gray ghost turned to look at the skull, and something about her body language soured. What? A Fomor messenger is at the outer perimeter, the skull said. It sounded creepily like Bob, but there was a complete absence of anything but a vague contempt in its voice. He bears word from his lord. I got the impression that the gray ghost tilted her head beneath its hood. A servitor? Arriving from the Never Never? The outer perimeter is the Never Never side, of which I am custodian, the skull replied. The inner perimeter is the mortal world. You established that more than a year ago. The gray ghost made a disgusted sound. Have a care, spirit. You are not indispensable. She looked at the suspended Morty and sighed. Of course, The Fomor disturbed me with sunrise near. Why must my most important work continually be interrupted? The skull inclined itself in a nod of acknowledgement. Shall I kill him and send back the body along with a note suggesting that next time they call ahead? No, snapped the grey ghost. Of course not. Curb your tongue, spirit, lest I tear it out for you. If it pleases you to do so, I am but a servant, the skull said with another nod. The contempt in its tone held steady, though. Shall I allow him to pass? And be quick about it, the grey ghost snarled. As it pleases you, the skull replied, speaking noticeably more slowly than a moment before. It vanished into the floor. I held very, very still. Motion was the hardest thing for a veil to hide, and I suddenly realized that the one-shot, one-kill plan had a serious flaw in it. I had forgotten to account for evil Bob. The spirit was powerful, intelligent, dangerous, and apparently incapable of anything resembling fear or respect. I suppose that after a few decades of working with Kemmler, the most dangerous necromancer since the fall of the Roman Empire, it was difficult to take a lesser talent seriously. Not that regular Bob was exactly overflowing with respect and courtesy. Heh! Take that, bad guy. In any case, I had a chance to find out more about the enemy. You can't ever get too much dirt on these cloaked lunatics. Frequently learning more about them exposes some kind of gaping hole in their armor, metaphorical or otherwise. I have never had cause to regret knowing more about an enemy before commencing a fight. Besides, if the Grey Ghost was a part of some kind of partnership instead of operating alone, I had to know about it. Bad guy alliances were never good news. The Grey Ghost stepped away from the pit. In fewer than 30 seconds, the ground rippled again, and a man appeared, arising from the ground a bit at a time, as if he were walking up a stairway. The skull came with him, floating along behind, just above the level of his head. I recognized him at once, the leader of the Fomor servitors who had come after Molly. He was still dressed in the black turtleneck, but had added a weapons belt with a holstered pistol beneath his left hand and a short sword at his right. It was one of those Japanese blades, but shorter than the full katana. Wakizashi, then, or maybe it was a ninja-toe. If it was, minus points for carrying it around out in the open like that. Oh, there was something else odd about him. His eyes had changed color. I remembered them as a clear gray. Now they were a deep, deep purple. I don't mean purple like the dark violet eyes that lots of Bob's romance novel heroines always seem to have. They were purple like a bruised corpse, or like the last colors of a twilit sky. He faced the Grey Ghost calmly and bowed from the waist, the gesture slow and fluid. Greetings, Lady Shade, from my master, Cantrev Lord Omach. Hello. Listen, the Grey Ghost replied, her tone sour. What does Omach want from me now? Listen bowed again, purple eyes gleaming. My master desires to know whether or not your campaign is complete. The Grey Ghost's voice came out from between clenched teeth. Obviously not. Listen bowed. He would know, then, why you have escalated your search to a seizure of a second-tier asset. The servitor paused to glance at Morty, and then back to the robed figure. This action runs counter to your arrangement. The eye sockets of the skull flickered more brightly. We could still send the Fomor the message about calling ahead. No, the Grey Ghost said severely. It would be simple and direct. No, spirit, the Grey Ghost snarled. I forbid it. The skull's eyes flickered rapidly for a moment, agitated, then it bowed lower and said, As you wish. The Grey Ghost turned to listen and said, My servant believes it would be logical to murder you and send your corpse back to your master in order to express my displeasure. Listen bowed again. "I am one of many, easily replaced. My death would be but a brief annoyance to my lord, and I think a somewhat anemic symbolic gesture." The Grey Ghost stared at him and then said, "If you weren't speaking the literal truth, I think I should be satisfied with letting the skull have you, but you really have no sense of self-preservation at all." "Of course I do, Lady Shade. I would never throw away my life carelessly. It would make it impossible for me to ensure that my death is of maximum advantage to my lord." The Grey Ghost shook her head within the hood. "You are a fool." "I will not contest the statement," Listen said. "However, Lady Shade, I must ask you for an answer to return to my lord." He added mildly, "Whatever form that answer may take." "Inform him," said the Grey Ghost, voice annoyed, "that I will do as I see fit to acquire an appropriate body." Whoa! The Lady Shade was looking for a meat suit, which meant I shook off the line of logic to be examined later. I focused on the conversation at hand. "You made no mention of requiring such a valuable specimen for your ends," Listen said. "Look at what I have to work with," Lady Shade snarled, gesturing at the big hoods gathered around the pit. "Scraps that cannot support the weight of my talent. Tell Omach that if he wishes an ally who can face the wardens, he must be tolerant. This specimen is of the least value to his purposes and the greatest to mine." Listen considered that for a moment and then nodded. "And the rag lady?" "Once I am seated within a mortal form, I will deal with her," Lady Shade said. Her voice became detectably smug. "Assuming, of course, you have not already removed her yourself. Is that a burn on your cheek, Listen? I hope it does not pain you." "Very kind, lady," Listen said with another bow. "I am in no discomfort worth noting. May I tell my lord that you will make him a gift of these fourth-tier creatures once you are restored?" Lady Shade seemed to consider that for a moment. She tilted her head and looked around at the big hoods. "Yes, I suppose so. I'll have little need for such baubles." "Excellent," Listen said. He sounded genuinely pleased. Lady Shade shook her head again. "Is he so enamored of such minor talents?" "A moment ago," Listen said, "I was preparing to inform him of the potential loss of a second tier. Now I may inform him of the probable gain of a dozen lesser acquisitions. It pleases me to draw positive gains from my lord from negative situations." From his place dangling over the pit, Morty said in a slurred voice, "Tell him he ain't getting squat. Bitch can't have me." Listen lifted both eyebrows and looked at Lady Shade. "I require his consent," the Lady Shade said, her voice tight. "I will have it. Had you not interrupted me, I would have it already. Now dawn nears. It may be several hours after sundown before I complete the transfer." "Ah," Listen said. Nothing in his tone made him sound overly skeptical, but I got the impression that he was nonetheless. "Then, with your leave, I will depart to carry word to my lord and trouble you no more." Evil Bob popped up into sight over Listen's shoulder again. "Are you sure you do not wish this creature to be departed, my lady?" "Go in peace, Listen," Lady Shade said without so much as glancing at Evil Bob. "Inform your lord that I anticipate that we will be able to move against the Rag Lady and her allies in the fortress sometime tomorrow evening." Listen bowed at the waist again. Then he turned and, followed by the floating skull, stepped down into the floor, vanishing from mortal reality and into the spirit world. The moment Listen was gone, Lady Shade waved a hand, and with reedy howls of protest, the wraiths in the pit were unceremoniously scattered from it. the heavy bass beat of the beacon's spell coming to an abrupt halt. The will of Lady Shade pressed against them like the current of a river, and they were driven from the chamber, carried out through the walls and the floor by an unseen force. I could feel it myself, the force of her will, simultaneously banishing the wraiths and commanding the attention of the lemurs in the chamber. I fought to hold still before it, to let it slide away from me, around my veil, to use it to help me hide rather than being revealed by it. "Children," she said, her tone full of contempt, "beware, the dawn approaches. To your sanctums, all." She turned to the big hoods. "Mortal dears, Mother is pleased with you. Keep safe the prisoner until nightfall. His life is worth the world to me. Guard him with your own." The big hoods shivered, as if they'd heard the voice of a god whispering in their minds, and bowed their heads as one. They murmured words of some kind of ritual devotion, though they were too mush-mouthed for me to clearly understand them. The lemurs began clearing out at once, rising from their activities, or lack thereof, and departing, moving silently from the chamber. I got lucky. None of them actually plowed into me by mistake. "Well," murmured Lady Shade to Morty, "we shall continue our discussion in several hours. You will have no food, no water. You will not be untied. I'm sure that sooner or later you will see things my way." "I would rather die than let you in," Morty replied, his voice a croak. "You can't always have what you want, dear child," Lady Shade said. Her voice was matter-of-fact, calm, and practical. "I will continue to hurt you, and eventually you will be willing to do anything to stop the pain. It is an unfortunate limit of mortality." Morty said nothing. I couldn't tell whether he shivered at the cold-blooded confidence in her voice, but I did. And I realized, finally, who I was dealing with. The gray ghost turned and sank into the floor, evidently moving into a domain in the never-never. I waited until I was sure she was gone, then simply vanished, straight up, appearing over the streets of Chicago above. Dawn was a golden promise over the eastern horizon. I headed toward my grave as fast as I could possibly travel. The gray ghost was a shade. That I knew. But where had the shade come from? From someone with a knowledge of possessing others' bodies. From someone who seemed confident she could confront the wardens of the White Council, the cops of the wizarding world, and come out on top. From someone who had been known to this Omach person, whoever he was, and who needed a body with enough of an innate gift for magic to support what was apparently a much greater talent. Only so many people with a wizard's level of ability had perished in Chicago. Most of them had been foes of mine. I hadn't been the one to gack all of them, but I'd killed this one. With a gun, no less, from about 10 feet away. I reached the shelter of my grave and sank into it gratefully, still shivering. Morty was in the hands of the corpse taker, one of the heirs of that lunatic Kemmler, a body-hopping wizard with a serious case of the long-term crazies, and maybe 3 or 4 times my own ability with magic. If she got into Morty, I was guessing that, like me, she would have access to her full abilities once more. She would be able to start hopping bodies again, and pick up her career right where she left off. And she'd start by killing Molly. I'd survived my original encounter with her thanks only to the intervention of Gentleman John Marcone, a little bit of good luck and better guesswork, and some truly epic paranoia. She was an absolute first-class threat, one I would prefer to avoid confronting at all, much less alone. Sunrise came roaring over the land, and I felt grateful to have it between the corpse taker and me. I was glad to have a chance to rest while I could. Things had gotten considerably more urgent. Come nightfall, I knew I was going to have to find a way to take her on. Chapter 30. I huddled in my grave as the sun rose. I would have thought I'd be more nervous about a personally lethal, fiery cataclysm sweeping over the world. But I wasn't. When dawn came, it was like listening to a big truck roll by outside. Dangerous if you were in front of it, but nothing but background noise if you weren't. My grave was peaceful. I tried to track that feeling, to identify that sense of contentment I enjoyed down in the ground. It took me a few moments, but then I understood. It was like being in my basement apartment during a winter storm. Outside, the wind howled and the snow and sleet fell, but I was home with Mouse and Mister piled onto the couch for warmth, sipping a cup of hot chicken soup in front of a big fire in the fireplace and reading a good book. It was the same thing resting in my grave. Peace. I wasn't going anywhere, and it made me happy. If only I'd brought a book, my day would have been perfect. Instead, I just leaned back against the earthen wall of the grave and closed my eyes, soaking in the quiet. I would be trapped here until sundown. There was no sense in chewing my own guts out, worrying about what would happen that evening. I drifted through my memories, sad and joyous and just plain ridiculous. I thought about Elaine and me in high school. We had lived like superheroes, two young people with incredible powers who must hide themselves from those around them, lest they be isolated and persecuted for their differentness. I hadn't really been interested in girls yet when I met Elaine. We'd both been 12, bright and stubborn, which meant that we generally drove each other crazy. We had also been best friends, talking about our dreams of the future, sharing tears or a shoulder, whichever was needed. At school, we both found the subject matter to be tedious beyond bearing. In comparison to the complexity of Justin's lessons, acquitting ourselves well in the public school curriculum had only been nominally more difficult than sharpening a pencil. It was difficult to relate to the other kids in many ways. We just weren't interested in the same things. Our magic talents increasingly made television a difficulty, and video games had been downright impossible. Elaine and I wound up playing a lot of card and board games, or spending long, quiet hours in the same room, reading. Justin had manipulated us both masterfully. He wanted us to bond. He wanted us to feel isolated from everyone else and loyal to him. Though he put up a facade about it that fooled me at the time, he wanted us to work through our nascent sexuality with each other and save him the bother of explaining anything, or the risk of either Elaine or me forming attachments with someone outside our little circle. I never suspected a thing about what he really wanted until the day Elaine stayed home sick. Concerned about her, I skipped my last class and came home early. The house seemed too quiet, and an energy I had never sensed before hung in the air like cloying, oily perfume. The second I walked in the door, I found myself tensing up. It was my first encounter with black magic, the power of creation itself, twisted to maim and destroy everything it touched. Elaine sat on the couch, her expression calm, her spine locked rigidly into perfect posture. I now know that Justin had put the mental whammy on her while I was gone, but at the time, I knew only that my instincts were screaming that something was wrong, a wrongness so fundamental it made me want to run away screaming filled the room. And besides, Elaine only sat like that when she was making a statement, generally a sarcastic one. I still remembered it, plain as day. Justin appeared in the kitchen doorway on the other side of Elaine and stood there for a moment looking at me, his expression calm. "You skipped class again," he sighed. I probably should have seen that coming. "What's going on here?" I demanded, my voice high and squeaky with fear. "What have you done?" Justin walked to the couch to stand over Elaine. Both of them stared at me for a long moment. I couldn't read their expressions at all. I'm making plans, Harry, he said in a steady, quiet voice. I need people I can trust. Trust? I asked. His words didn't make sense. I couldn't see how they applied to the current situation. I couldn't see how they would make sense at all. I looked from Elaine back to Justin again, searching for some kind of explanation. Their expressions gave me nothing. That was when my eyes fell to the coffee table and to the object lying quietly next to my well-mauled paperback copy of The Hobbit. A straitjacket. There was something quietly, calmly sinister in the congruence. I just stared for a moment, and the bottom fell out of my stomach as I finally realized for the first awful time what my instinct had been screaming at me. I was in danger. That my rescuer, teacher, my guardian meant to do me harm. Tears blurred my vision as I asked him in a very quiet, very confused voice, "Why?" Justin remained calm. "You don't have the knowledge you need to understand, boy. Not yet. But you will in time." You can't do this," I whispered. "Not you. You saved me. You saved us." "And I still am," Justin said. "Sit down next to Elaine, Harry." From the couch, Elaine said in a quiet, dreamy monotone, "Sit down next to me, Harry." I stared at her in shock and took a step back. "Elaine!" Justin threw kinetomancy at me when I looked away. Some instinct warned me in the last fraction of a second, but instead of trying to block the strike, I moved with it, toward the front picture window, weaving my own spell as I went. Instead of interposing my shield, I spread it wide in front of me like a sail, catching the force of Justin's blast and harnessing it. Me, my shield, Justin's energy, and that picture window exploded onto the front lawn. I remembered the enormous sound of the shattering glass and wood and the hot sting of a dozen tiny cuts from bits of flying glass and wood. I remember being furious and terrified. I went through the open space where the window had been, fell onto the lawn, took it in a roll, and came up sprinting. "Boy!" Justin said, projecting his voice loudly. I looked over my shoulder at him as I ran. His eyes were more coldly furious than I had ever seen them. "You are here with me, with Elaine, or you are nowhere. If you don't come back right now, you are dead to me." I lopped the last two words off the sentence to get his real meaning and poured on more speed. If I stayed, he meant to render me helpless, and from that beginning there could be no good endings. If I went back angry, I could fight him. But I couldn't win, not against the man who taught me everything I knew. I couldn't call the cops and tell them Justin was a mad wizard. They'd write me off as a nutcase or prankster without thinking twice. It wasn't like I could run to Oz and ask a more powerful wizard for help. He'd never told me about the White Council or the rest of the supernatural world. Abusers like to isolate their victims. People who feel that they are completely alone tend not to fight back. "Boy!" Justin's voice roared, now openly filled with rage. "Boy!" He didn't need to say anything more. That rage said it all. The man who had given me a home was going to kill me. It hurt so much. I wondered if he already had. I put my head down and ran faster, my tears making the world a blur, with only one thought burning in my head. This wasn't over. I knew that Justin could find me, no matter where I ran, no matter how well I hid. I hadn't escaped that straitjacket. I had only delayed it for a little while. I didn't have any choice. I had to fight back. "What happened next?" asked a fascinated voice. I shook my head and snapped out of the reverie, looking up to the sunlit sky outside my grave. Winter's hold was definitely weakening. The sky was gray clouds interspersed with streaks of summer blue sky. There was a lot of water dripping down the edges of my grave, though the snow at the bottom was still holding its chill. The Lananshi sat at the edge of my grave, her bare, dirty feet swinging back and forth. Her bright red hair had been bound back in a long tail, and she was dressed in the shreds of 5 or 6 different outfits. Her head was wrapped in a scarf that had been knitted from yarn duplicating various colors of dirty snow, and the tattered ends of it hung down on either side of her head. It gave her a sort of lunatic, coquette charm, especially considering the flecks of what looked like dried blood on the pale skin of her face. She looked as happy as a kid on Christmas morning. I just stared up for a moment and then shook my head faintly. "You saw that? What I was thinking?" "I see you," she said, as though that explained it. "Not what you were thinking, what you were remembering." "Interesting," I said. It made a certain amount of sense that Leah could discern the spirit world better than I could. She was a creature who was at least partly native to the Never Never. I probably looked like some kind of pale, white, ghostly version of myself to her, while the memories that were my substance played across the surface. I thought about the wraiths and lemurs that Sir Stuart had put down on my first night as a ghost, and how they had seemed to bleed images as they faded away. "Yes," she said, her tone pleased. "Precisely like that. My, but the colonial knight put on a display for you." "You knew Sir Stuart?" "I have seen him in battle on several occasions," Leah said, her eyes somewhat dreamy. "He is a worthy gentleman in his fashion, quite dangerous." "Not more dangerous than the corpse taker," I said. "She destroyed him." Leah thrust out her lower lip and her brow furrowed in annoyance. "Did she? What a contemptible waste of a perfectly doughty spirit." She rolled her eyes. "At least, my godchild, you have discerned your foe's identity, and that of her pet." I shivered. Her and Evil Bob. She waved a hand. "Evil is mainly an aesthetic choice. Only the spirit's power is significant for your purposes." "Not true," I said mildly, though I know you don't agree. Her expression was pensive for a moment before she said, "You have your mother's sight, you know?" "Not her eyes?" "I've always thought you favored Malcolm." The serious expression vanished, and she kicked her feet again. "So, young shade, what happened next?" "You know, you were there." "How do the mortals say it?" she murmured. "I missed that episode." I coughed out a surprised little laugh. She looked faintly miffed. "I do not know what happened between the time you left Justin and the time you came to me." "I see," I grinned at her. "Do you think I just give away stories for free to one of the she?" She tilted back her head and laughed, and her eyes twinkled, like literally with little flashes of light. "You have learned much. I began to despair of it, but it seems you may have acquired wisdom enough, and in time." "In time to be dead," I said. "But yeah, I've worked out by now that the she don't give anything away, or take anything for free. And after however long, I realized why that might be. Because you can't." "Indeed," she said, beaming at me. "There must be balance, sweet godchild. Always balance. Never take a thing without giving such a thing in return. Never give a favor without collecting one in kind. All of reality depends on balance." I squinted at her. "That's why you gave Bianca Amorakius years ago? So that you could accept that knife from her, the one Mab took from you?" She leaned toward me, her eyes all but glowing with intensity, and her teeth showing in a sudden carnivorous smile. "Indeed, and such a treacherous gift it was, child. Oh, but if that deceitful creature had survived you, such a vengeance I would have wreaked that the world would have spoken of it in whispers for 1,000 years. I squinted at her. But I killed Bianca before you could balance the scales. Indeed, simple boy. Why else think you that I gifted you with the most potent powers of fairy to protect you and your companions when we battled Bianca's ultimate progenitors? I thought you did it because Mab ordered you to. In all of winter, I am second in power only to Mab, which she has allowed because I have incurred with it proportionate obligation to her. She is my dearest enemy, but even I do not owe Mab so much. I helped you as much as I did, sweet child, because I owed you for collecting a portion of my due justice from Bianca. The Lananshi said. Her eyes grew wider, wilder. The rest I took from the little whore's masters, though I admit I hadn't expected the collection to be quite so thorough. Memories flashed in my head. Susan, an obsidian knife. I felt sick. I'll get over it, I told myself, eventually. It hadn't been much more than a day from my point of view. I was probably still in shock or trauma or something. If ghosts could get that, I mean. I looked up and realized that Leah was staring at me, at my memories, with undisguised glee. She let out a contented sigh and said, "You do not settle things by half measures, do you, my godson?" I could get mad at her for being so callous about calling those memories to my mind, or I could revile her for taking such joy in so much destruction and pain, but there wasn't a point in doing so. My godmother was what she was, a being of violence, deceit, and the thirst for power. She wasn't human. Her attitudes and reactions could not fairly be called inhumane. Besides, I had gotten to know Leah's sovereign, Queen Mab, in a fashion so hideously intimate that I could not possibly describe it. And believe me, if Leah had been the high priestess of murder, bloodlust, scheming, and manipulation, then Mab was the goddess my godmother worshipped. Come to think of it, that was probably an apt description of their relationship. 6 of one, a half dozen of another. My godmother wasn't going to change. There was no sense in holding what she was against her. So I just gave her a tired, whimsical smile instead. Saves time, I told her. Do it thoroughly once and you don't have to fool around with it again later. She dropped back her head and let out a deep-throated laugh. Then she tilted her head and looked at me. You didn't realize what would happen to mortal kind when you struck down the Red King and his brood, did you? I saw the opportunity, I said, after a moment. If I'd stopped to think about the trouble it would create, I don't know if I'd have done it any differently. They had my girl. Her eyes gleamed. Spoken as someone worthy to wield power. Coming from you, I said, that's a little bit unsettling, actually. She kicked both feet, girlishly pleased, and smiled down at me. How sweet of you to say so. The best thing about my fairy godmother is that the creepy just keeps on coming. I'll trade you, I said. The rest of the tale for information. She nodded her head in a businesslike fashion. The tale for questions 3. Done. Done, done, and done, she replied. So I told her. Chapter 31. I ran and ran for a good long while. I wasn't on the cross-country team at school, but I often went running with Elaine. It was how we'd hidden, sneaking off to make out and stuff from Justin. He was a thorough sort of guy, so we made sure to actually do the running too, in order to make our deception flawless. And the whole time we thought we were getting away with it. As an adult, I could see that our efforts were about as obvious as they could possibly be. Justin had known, I was certain, now, but back then, Elaine and I had been sure that we were masters of deceit. That scheme's trappings were sure as hell turning out to be handy that day. My stride slowed but turned longer, steadier, machine-like. I was 16. I didn't wind down for almost an hour. When I finally stopped, the terror had faded, if not the heartache, and I found myself in an entirely unexpected position. I didn't know what was coming next. I didn't know what was expected of me. I had to think, all by myself. I ducked off the road and into a large culvert, huddling there while I got my breath back and flailed at the wet paper bag my brain was trapped within. Mostly, I just kept thinking that I should have known. No one in my life had gone an inch out of their way to look out for me once my parents were gone. Justin's generosity, even seasoned with the demands of studying magic, had been too good to be true. I should have known it. And Elaine. She'd just sat there while he'd been doing whatever he was going to do. She hadn't tried to warn me, hadn't tried to stop him. I had never known anyone in my life I had loved as much as Elaine. I should have known she was too good to be true, too. I wept for a while. I was tired and cold, and my chest ached with the pain of loss. In a single moment, my home had been destroyed. My life had been destroyed. But I shook my head ferociously, wiping my eyes and my nose on the leather sleeves of my jacket, heedless of what it did to them. I was still in danger. I had to think. I had no means of travel, no money, and no idea where to go. Hell's bells. I was lucky I had my shiny new driver's license in my pocket. It was mid-November, and my school letter jacket wasn't going to be enough to keep me warm once it got dark. My stomach made a cavernous noise, and I added starving hunger to my list of problems. I needed shelter. I needed food. I needed to find someplace safe to hide from my mentor until I could figure out how to take him on. And to get all of that, I needed money. And I needed it fast. So, once it got dark, Look, I was 16. Once it got dark, I sort of knocked over a convenience store. For lack of anything better to hide my face, I tied my sweaty t-shirt around my head in a sort of makeshift balaclava. I didn't have anything else to wear except my letter jacket, which seemed more or less like a screaming advertisement to make it simple for the cops to figure out my identity. There wasn't much I could do except to rip all the patches off of it and hope for the best. After that, I'd scavenged a paper sack from a trash bin, emptied it, and stuck my right hand in it. Once I had my equipment ready, I looked up at the streetlights glowing outside the quick stop and flicked a quick hex at them. Learning magic is hard, but if you can do even fairly modest spells, you find out that wrecking technology is easy. Anything with electronics built into it is particularly susceptible to a hex. But if you put enough oomph into it, even simpler technology can be shorted out or otherwise made to malfunction. At 16, I wasn't anywhere near the wizard I would be even 5 or 6 years later, but those lights didn't have a prayer. The 2 streetlights over the parking lot flickered and went black. I hit the lights outside the store next, and 2 security cameras. I was getting increasingly nervous as I went along, and the last hex accidentally blew out the store's freezers and overhead lights along with the security camera. The only lighting left in the place came from a pinball machine and a couple of aging arcade video games. I swallowed and hit the door, going through in a half-doubled-over crouch so that there wouldn't be any way to compare my height to the marker on the inside frame of the door. I held out my right hand like it was a gun, which it might have been. I had the paper sack I'd acquired pulled over it. There was something cold and squishy and greasy on the inside of the bag. Mayonnaise, maybe. I hated mayo. I hustled up to the cashier, a young man with a brown mullet and a Boston t-shirt, pointed the paper sack at him and said, "Empty the drawer." He blinked red and watery eyes at me, then at the paper bag. "Empty the drawer, or I'll blow your head off," I shouted. It probably would have been more intimidating if my voice hadn't cracked in the middle. Man, and I finally twigged to the scent of recently burned marijuana. The guy didn't look scared. He looked confused. Dude, did you see the lights? I really hadn't wanted to do this, but I didn't have much of a choice. I made a little bit of a production of turning the gun to point at the liquor bottles behind the counter, gathered up my will and screamed, "Kabang! Kabang!" My verbal incantations have actually gotten more sophisticated and worldly over the years, not less. I know, right? It shocks me too. The spell was just basic kinetic energy, and it didn't really hit much harder than a baseball thrown by a high school pitcher. A regular pitcher, not like Robert Redford in The Natural. That wasn't really enough power to threaten anyone's life, but it was noisy, and it was more than enough energy to smash a couple of bottles. They shattered with loud barking sounds and showers of glass and booze. "Holy crap!" shouted the cashier. I saw that his name tag read Stan. "Dude!" He flinched down, holding his arms up around his head. "Don't shoot!" I pointed the paper bag at him and said, "Give me all the money, Stan." Okay, Stan said. "Oh, God, don't kill me." "Money!" I shouted. He turned to the register and started fumbling at it, stabbing at the keys. As he did, I sensed a movement behind me, an almost subliminal presence. It's the kind of thing you expect to experience while standing in a line, the silent pressure of another living being behind you, temporarily sharing your space. But I wasn't standing in a line, and I whirled in panic and shouted, "Kabang!" again. There was a loud snap of sound as pure force lashed through the air and the glass door to a freezer of ice cream shattered. "Oh, God!" Stan moaned. "Please, don't kill me!" There was no one behind me. I tried to look in every direction at once and more or less succeeded. There was no one else in the store. And yet the presence was still there, on the back of my neck, closer and more distinct than a moment before. What the hell? "Run!" said a resonant baritone. I turned and pointed the paper bag at the pair of video games. "Run!" said the voice on the Sinistar game. "I live. I am Sinistar." "Don't move," I said to Stan. "Just put the money in a bag." "Money in a bag, man," Stan panted. He was practically sobbing. "I'm supposed to do whatever you want, right? That's what the owners have told us cashiers, right? I'm supposed to give you the money. No argument. Okay?" "Okay," I said, my eyes flicking nervously around the place. "It's not worth dying for, is it, Stan?" "Got that right," Stan muttered. "They're only paying me $5 an hour." He finally managed to open the drawer and started fumbling bills into a plastic bag. "Okay, dude, just a second." "Run," said the Sinistar machine. "Run." Again, the insubstantial pressure against the back of my neck increased. I turned in a slow circle, but nothing was there. Nothing I could see, at any rate. But what if there was something there? Something that couldn't be seen. I had never actually seen something summoned from the netherworld, but Justin had described such beings repeatedly, and I didn't think he'd been lying. Such a beast would make an ideal hunter, just the sort of thing to send out after a mouthy apprentice who refused to wear his straitjacket like a good boy. I took 2 slow steps toward the video game, staring at its screen. I didn't pay attention to the spaceship or the asteroids or the giant disembodied skull flying around. I didn't care about the flickers of static that washed across the screen as I got closer, something inside its computer reacting to my presence. No. I paid attention to the glass screen and to the reflection of the store that shone dimly upon it. I identified my outline on it, long and thin. I could see the vague outlines of the store as more shadowy shapes, aisles and end caps, the counter and the door. And the thing standing just inside the door. It was huge. I mean, it was taller and broader than the door was. It was more or less humanoid. The proportions were wrong. The shoulders too wide, the arms too long, the legs crooked and too thick. It was covered in fur or scales or some scabrous fungal amalgamation of both, and its eyes were empty angled pits of dim violet light. I felt my hands begin to shake, tremble. Actually, they became absolutely spastic. The paper bag made a steady, rattling sound. There was a creature from another world standing behind me. I could feel it. No more than 7 or 8 feet away from me, every bit as real as Stan, to every sense but my sight. It took a real effort to move my head enough to cast a single hurried glance over my shoulder. Nothing. Stan was shoveling various bills into a bag. The store was otherwise empty. The door hadn't opened since I'd come through it. There was a bell on it. It would have rung had it opened. I looked back at the reflection. The thing was 2 feet closer. And it was smiling. It had a head whose shape was all but obscured by growths or lumpy scales or matted fur, but beneath its eyes I could see a mouth, too wide to be real, filled with teeth too sharp and serrated and yellow to belong to anything of this earth. That was a smile from Lewis Carroll's opium-inspired, laudanum-dosed nightmares. My legs felt like they were going to collapse into water at any second. I couldn't catch my breath. I couldn't move. Malice slithered up my spine and danced in spiteful shivers over the back of my neck. I could sense the thing's hostility, not the mindless anger of a fellow boy I'd needled beyond self-restraint, or Justin's cold, logical rage. This was something different, something vaster, more timeless, and deeper than any ocean. It was a poisonous hate, something so ancient, so vile that it could almost kill without any other action or being to support it. A hate so old and so virulent that it had curdled and congealed over its surface into a stinking, staggering contempt. This thing wanted to destroy me. It wanted to hurt me. It wanted to enjoy the process. And nothing I said, nothing I did, would ever change that. I was something to be eradicated, preferably in some amusing fashion. It had no mercy. It had no fear. And it was old beyond my ability to comprehend. It was patient. And if I proved too disappointing to it, I would only break through the veneer of that contempt, and what lay beneath would dissolve me like the deadliest acid. I felt stained, simply by feeling its presence, stained as if it had left some hideous imprint or mark upon me, one that could not be wiped away. And then it was behind me, so close it could almost touch, its outline towering over me, huge and horrible. And it leaned down. A forked tongue slithered out from between its horrible, sharp, chainsaw teeth, and it whispered, in a perfectly low, calm British accent, "What you have just sensed is as close as your mind can come to encompassing my name. How do you do?" I tried to talk. I couldn't make the words form in my mouth. I couldn't get enough air to push my voice up out of my throat. Damn it! Damn it, I was more than some terrified child. I was more than some helpless orphan preparing to endure what someone vastly older and more powerful than me was preparing to inflict. I had touched the very forces of creation. I was a young force of nature. I had seen things no one else could see, done things no one else could do. And in a moment like that, there was only one thing I could ask myself. What would Jack Burton do? "I'm fine," I said in a hoarse, hardly understandable voice. "That's a mouthful, and I'm busy. Do you maybe have a nickname?" Its smile widened. "Little morsel among those whom I have disassembled," it purred, its tone wrapping lovingly around the last word of the phrase. "I have several times been called by the same phrase." "Oh? Oh? What's that?" "He," purred the thing, "who walks behind." Chapter 32. "He who walks behind," I said, fighting a losing battle to keep from trembling. "As scary names go, that one kind of isn't. I stick with the first one, more evocative." "Be patient," purred the creature's disembodied voice. "You will understand it before the end." Dude," Stan asked quietly, "who are you talking to?" "Oh, tell him," the creature said. "That should be entertaining." "Shut up, Stan," I said, "and get out." Said Stan. "What?" I whirled on him and pointed the paper bag at him, my arms extending through the space where he who walks behind apparently both was and wasn't. "Get the hell out of here!" Stan fell all over himself trying to comply. He literally went to the tile floor twice on his way to the door, his eyes wide, and stumbled out and into the night. I turned back to the reflective surface of the video game's screen. And just as I again found the shape inside it, fire erupted along my spine. I was slammed forward into the video game, and my head hit it hard enough to send a spiderweb of cracks through the machine's glass screen. Pain, sickening and harsh, flooded through my skull, and I staggered. But I didn't fall. Justin Dumorn had been hard on me. It hadn't ever been this bad, this scary. And it had never hurt so much. But then it had never been for real. I grabbed the machine's sides, forced my fingers to hold on, and kept myself from falling. "Run! Run!" screamed the machine again. This time the voice was blurred and distorted, disturbingly deep and malicious. I noted blurrily that the cracked and wildly flickering screen had a terrified wizard's blood all over it. The game's computer was apparently failing. "You think that the inebriated little mortal is going to run to fetch the authorities?" purred the creature's voice. I turned my head, looking around, and didn't see anything. But the motion sent fire down my back, and for the first time I felt a trickling there beneath my jacket. I was bleeding. "You think that if they come running in their vehicles with their lights and their symbols that I will flee?" I turned and put my back to the machine. My legs felt wobbly, but I was beginning to fight through the pain. I clenched my teeth and snarled, "Get away from me!" "I assure you," came the creature's bodiless voice, "that we will not be disturbed. I have made sure of it. But it does demonstrate that you possess a certain talent for performance under pressure, does it not?" "You sound like my guidance counselor," I said, and wiped blood from one of my eyes. I took a breath and stalked forward, wobbling only a little. I grabbed the bag of money Stan had left on the counter. "I guess maybe you are a little scary?" "Neither fear nor pain sway you from your objective. Excellent." This time, the thing's voice was coming from the far side of the convenience store. "But there's no knowing the true temper of the blade until it has been tested. Even the strongest-seeming steel may have hidden flaws. This may be interesting."